watching the Jennylyn Show, and today I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. James Dalessandro, another fascinating person. I have been privileged to sit here and interview fascinating people, and today is no exception. James, welcome.
Thank you, Jennylyn. Nice to be here.
I'm so happy that you could join me.
Well, it's great to be here. We've tried a few times before and not been successful, so.
I always believe everything happens when it should, so thank you. And there's so much about you that I've read, and I'd like to learn what I haven't read. So why don't we start with what brought you to California? Because I read you were born and raised in Ohio, am I right?
Yes. Well, a couple of things will bring you to California. 45 degrees below zero on Lake Erie would be one of them. But, you know, when you're raised in the Midwest, California was always the promised land. You would see photographs. I remember seeing a photo spread in Life magazine about Santa Monica and Venice Beach. And then when I was in college, I wanted to be a writer from the time I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, you know.
Really?
Yeah, and when I was in college, I remember seeing a documentary on the Beat Poets in San Francisco, on Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder. And I had been writing short stories and poems and things, so I said, wow, San Francisco, that sounds like, you know, like a fabulous place. Berkeley was obviously pretty famous because of the free speech movement, you know. And it just seemed like, you know, it just seemed there were things here that really appealed to me. You know, I never felt quite at home in Cleveland, Ohio, and in college and stuff. I enjoyed myself, but it just felt like the things that were attractive to me were California, not the least of which was the weather and, you know, and writing and all that stuff.
Well, welcome. I'm so glad you came because you've made such a difference, at least I heard that you were the first person to start a poetry club in the Bay Area. Is that correct?
What happened was, this is kind of a weird story. When I was watching the documentary on Ferlinghetti and Ginsberg, Lawrence Ferlinghetti wrote a poem called Starting from San Francisco, from the window of his house on Potrero Hill.
Yeah.
And I said, wow, a poetry scene. I was writing, and you know, I wrote skits and I wrote a lot of poems. I actually had a book manuscript I put together since I was about 16 or 17 years old. And so I hitchhiked to California with a friend after college, and I got to North Beach and I went into City Lights Books and I said, wow, where's the poetry scene? Something inane like that. And they said, well, you're about 10 years too late. And I said, well, that's too bad. And they said, yeah, it's really, you know, kind of died down. And then I met Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Sometimes a Great Notion, at his place in Eugene, Oregon. I had a friend who happened to be a friend of Ken Kesey's, and we just drove to his farm one day, and he welcomed us and said, what do you do? First thing he said to me was, he said, you're a wrestler, right? And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I wrestled in college. And he was an NCAA wrestling champion. He was a world-class wrestler. He was an Olympic caliber wrestler. So he said, let's go out. He said, I just cleaned a pig pen. Let's go out and wrestle. And he's a big guy. He was about 220. I was 160. And I was a good wrestler, though. But he just killed me. I mean, he was the strongest man I ever saw. And we had fun. We beat each other up. He beat me up mostly.
Why did he ask you that?
I don't know what it was. You know, I was a carpenter. I was a pretty fit guy. I mean, you could tell I was strong and I was in shape. And he just looked at me and he asked, he said, it was just something about Ken Kesey. He was one of my dearest friends ever. And he just said, are you a wrestler or you're a wrestler? And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact. He said, where'd you wrestle? And he had actually wrestled my coach. My coach was a national champion and he had wrestled Kesey once. And so he said, oh, you want a Harry Huska's guys? And I said, yeah. And I said, well, anyway, that's how it started. And then we stayed friends. And one day I was saying to him, I said, you know, it's tragic that the poetry festivals he said, let's do it. Let's start another one. I said, okay. So in my hometown of Santa Cruz, I rented an auditorium. A friend lent me $300. And we invited Lawrence Ferlinghetti. I'd met Lawrence Ferlinghetti and befriended him. I remember sitting in his little attic with him, and I was talking to him. And all of a sudden, I looked out the window and I said, geez, it suddenly dawned on me that this is where that documentary was shot. So I asked Lawrence if he would do it, and he said yes. And then I met Michael McClure and everybody. And so we didn't know what would happen. I rented the Santa Cruz Civic Auditorium, and the night of the festival in November, I think it was November 5th, 1973.
Yeah.
The worst wind and rainstorm almost blew, Lawrence Ferlinghetti almost turned around, almost blew his van off the road when he was coming down from San Francisco. And I didn't know what would happen. You know, I said, this could be a disaster. This could be embarrassing. And we opened the doors at 7 o'clock, and I got there about 6 o'clock, and there was 1,800 people lined up. The line went for 3 blocks around the auditorium, all the way around back. 1,800 people. We set the attendance record. And it became the biggest, at the time, literary event in the country. I ran it for 4 years. Gary Snyder came, Allen Ginsberg was there, Charles Bukowski. We had jazz musicians, Anthony Braxton. Lawrence Ferlinghetti was kind enough to say that, I hate to quote stuff like this, but he said James Dalessandro gave a new birth to American poetry, which was nice. I was 23 years old at 24 years old. I was the youngest guy on the bill. And I read there, and I got tremendous responses to my work. And then Ken Kesey did one at the University of Oregon. It drew 3,500 people. And I got a huge ovation from the crowd there. So all of a sudden it was like, wow, maybe I could actually do this stuff. You know, maybe this is, you know, it was kind of a, you know, the first one's always free kind of thing, you know. And it was fun.
That's fascinating. So
yeah.
You just decided from that one conversation you had in that bookstore that somebody just needed to reinvent this whole poetry
I've
game.
always been that way. I've always felt that if something's worth doing and it's not being done, you know, do it. You know, don't wait for somebody else to do it for you. You know, again, I mean, obviously we'll get this into conversation. That's my attitude toward film and television work now. In the Bay Area, somebody just has to take the initiative to do things, you know, and that it's America. Anybody can do anything, you know. You just have to make up your mind you're going to do it, and then be smart enough and diligent enough to get it done.
Well, I love that about you. I think a lot of people have lots of ideas, yours truly included. And a lot of times when you think of something and you have a vision, a lot of times it could become something big, like you've done with the poetry thing. But people let fear stop them. And I'm one of those people because I let myself get dominated by the little voice that tells me it can't be done, otherwise somebody else would have done it. So you've obviously done that. When did you write the book that was made into the Earthquake, the movie about the San Francisco earthquake?
They haven't made the film yet. It's allegedly about to start.
Oh, okay.
A little bit. Okay, after I lived in San Francisco, I kind of lost interest in poetry. I'm one of those guys that as soon as he gets good at something, he's looking for something else to do.
Right.
So I had I published a book of poems, Canary in a Coal Mine. Sold very well. You know, I was pretty popular as, you know, strangely doesn't sound feasible, but pretty popular as a young poet. And but then I got kind of tired of it, you know. And I really always wanted to write books, novels, and film. I loved American film. This is when films were still wonderful, man. This was in, I mean, I grew up on the Waterfront, To Kill a Mockingbird, and,
wow,
you know, the great American
amazing
films. You know, those are the films that meant something to me. And that was still alive, you know, in the 70s when I got here. Chinatown was made. The 70s were wonderful for filmmaking. So I went to Los Angeles, and I went to UCLA Film School for many years, and started writing books and screenplays. After a while of writing screenplays, I came back to San Francisco. I missed San Francisco something terribly. And I wrote my first book, which was called Bohemian Heart. It was a murder mystery. It used the backdrop of the Moscone milk assassination. I love history. So I always try to take a story, a compelling, interesting story, and frame it against something wonderful. I think it's a good device that American novelists have used. The Alienist by Caleb Carr is great book. Always been a huge fan of the big historical epics. East of Eden, John Steinbeck's my favorite writer. So I wrote this book called Bohemian Heart, and it got wonderful reviews. I sold it as a movie script a couple of times. David Caruso, one of the reasons he left NYPD Blue was he bought the rights to my book. He was a friend of mine, and he wanted to do this film, and then they offered him Jade. So I needed another San Francisco story, and one day I picked up a book by the San Francisco historian Gladys Hansen about the 1906 earthquake called Denial of Disaster, and it said everything you think you know about the 1906 earthquake is wrong. So that gets my attention. And what it said was it was the greatest disaster in American history, and that the politicians lied about everything. They said only 478 people died when the death count is easily over 4,000. It could be as high as 6,000.
Really?
They said the army were the great heroes and the mayor, that they rallied and saved the city. What they did was they used dynamite to try to stop the fire, and every time they blew up a building, they started another dozen fires. They shot innocent people as suspected looters, and then they lied about it. I mean, what a big surprise the politicians lied, right? All of a sudden, here's this massive, amazing story. Enrico Caruso, the most famous entertainer of his era, generation, was at the San Francisco Opera House, left the stage 5 hours before the earthquake hit. This was the moment when San Francisco was coronated as the great city of the American West, because Caruso came and all of a sudden they found San Francisco as the wealthiest and most sophisticated. I mean, it rivaled any of the eastern cities. So here's this triumphal moment followed by the greatest disaster in American history. I still think it's even more astonishing than what happened in New Orleans and the Gulf Coast in 2005.
You do?
Well, yeah, because the earthquake actually tore a 300-mile path through Northern California. It destroyed every town from Mendocino down to San Jose. San Jose suffered 100% destruction, 100%. Santa Rosa and San Jose were completely, literally 100%, and not a building left standing. And that never gets into the story. So all of a sudden I had the great story, I thought. And I put some fictional characters in there that kind of fill in. That's what I do. I try to be meticulously accurate to the truth, and I put some interesting fictional characters to represent the little guy that gets left out.
How did you find the details?
Research, 7 years worth of reading. I'm obsessive. I have 200 books on what happened. I have the city records about the rebuilding of the city. I have books on what kind of carriages people ride. I have a book on women's clothing from the 1900 to 1910, so I knew how they dressed. I read every newspaper article. I have the Rolls-Royce catalog from 1906. I mean, it's like, it's the fun part of the job, I think. Okay. I love history, and I think the best historical writers really transport you into a different time. You feel it, yeah, you smell it,
with that.
You see it, and
yes.
all of a sudden it's just, you know, that's to me one of the most enjoyable things.
Right.
So anyway, long story short, I apologize. What happened was I was writing the book. I was 6 chapters. I had a whole outline, and my manager in New York, Peter Miller, called me and said, "Did you read the trades this morning, Daily Variety?" And I said, "No, I had a subscription. It gets there 2 days later." And he said, "Well, Titanic just did $1 billion at the box office. 1973, The Godfather was the first movie ever to gross $100 million at the box office. So here you're talking about, what, about 30 years later, somebody broke the $1 billion box office mark. It had never been done before. And so he said to me, they're going to be looking for another big disaster movie. And moron than I am, I never thought of it as a disaster. I thought of it as politics and corruption and Caruso and all this, but it was obviously a disaster in the midst of it. So I went to Hollywood, and I just had a funny feeling that this was going to work. My wife actually saved, I have a 3x5 card, and it says Barry Levinson, 11 o'clock, Steven Spielberg, 2 o'clock, Wolfgang Peterson, you know what I mean? I threw it away. My wife pulled it out of the trash. She said, "You may want to keep that for a souvenir."
Yeah, that's for the scrapbook.
Yeah. And so there was a bidding war. I always say people ask you, what are the crucial parts of a writer's life? There's 2 words, four words, 2 phrases, 4 words. The end, which means you finished it,
right.
And then bidding war. which means that when you hear people get these big chunks of money, the reason they got it is they got $1 million for something is the guy down the street offered $850. So I was a fortunate recipient of a bidding war. But then after I finished the screenplay and the book, the regime at Warner Brothers that bought it, they left. And there's been an endless stream of writers rewriting and changing and stuff. And Brad Bird, who just did Mission Impossible 4, is now continuing to rewrite the script and has stated that this will be his next project. And so maybe they'll actually get made in 2012. I have no hopes that any of my original stories or characters will be in the film, but I have no control over that.
So once you hand the script over to them, they do what they want with it.
I like to tell my students, I teach at the Academy of Arts in San Francisco, the difference between the writer and the screenwriter and the janitor is they allow the janitor on the set. And on that hierarchy, janitor, screenwriter, there's the original screenwriter, who is, for the most part, on his best day would be a minor annoyance to the people who follow after him. So they've never contacted me. You know, I really don't know what they're doing.
Well, you know, you probably have to come back because there's so much for you to share with me and my viewers. But before this show ends today, I would like to kind of somehow get James Dalessandro in a circle that makes sense. So you came to San Francisco, you reinvented the Poetry Club, you've been you've been writing books. That's now going to be made into a movie, hopefully before this year is over. It will be done.
Yeah.
And so now, what do you, I mean, you're obviously, if anybody's going to create some change here and make this also a movie mecca, it's probably going to be you, because you've already proven to us that you can do it. So what happens now? Because we talked earlier this morning in the green room, and you were telling me that you really believe that we can do this here, start a film industry here.
Well, I hope you're right, Jennylyn. I hope 1906 gets made this year. I hope Brad Bird gets the movie made. Hopefully he'll put his considerable storytelling skills into bringing that alive. Number one. Number two, on the second part of it, I think it's time for a renaissance. There has been filmmaking here before. There's an interesting book, I hope I give the man his due, Fog City Rebels. And it's a portrait of George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola and my dear friend Philip Kaufman, who did The Right Stuff here. And so there have been terrific filmmakers here who realize this is a marvelous place. What we have here is one of the greatest brain talent banks anywhere in the world. You have great cinematographers, fabulous actors. You know, Rita Moreno lives here. I mean, Sean Penn has lived here for quite a while. I don't know if he's back and forth with Los Angeles. His family and his children are still here. And George Lucas has a new film coming out called Red Tails about the Tuskegee Airmen. So, but all those guys are, you know, they're somewhat isolated. I don't mean that in any kind of negative sense. George Lucas makes George Lucas movies, which he's more than entitled to do. He's a phenomenon. And Francis Ford Coppola, you know, uses his own resources, as he said repeatedly, from his winery to finance his films. Bless his heart. He's a great filmmaker. I've loved his independent films the last few years. But what we really need here to resuscitate creativity in the Bay Area, I think, is television. Television, it used to be 30 years ago. The movies did the great stuff. They did To Kill a Mockingbird. And television did Starsky and Hutch. Now it's completely flipped on its ear. Feature films have spent so much money blowing things up and robots killing, just whatever it is, things that don't appeal to me and don't appeal to a huge part of the movie-going audience. I like stuff like The King's Speech and, Slumdog Millionaire. But if you look at television, you'll find out in particular the anti-hero is returned to television, Justified, The Shield. Breaking Bad is my absolute favorite show on AMC. And so what I did was in the last couple of years, in
Right.
the last 18 months, I've written 4 television pilots, all of them set in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Brilliant.
My first book, Bohemian Heart, which I've done as a series called Telegraph Hill.
Yeah.
I did another one called SOS. SOS is about an unrepentant stock market swindler who gets out of San Quentin after 3 years, and for his community service at the end. He has to work at a bottom-of-the-barrel social services outfit in the Tenderloin,
Yes.
which is the exact opposite of his $14 million mansion in Pacific Heights. And he finds out that there's more life and humanity in the Tenderloin than there ever was in the world that he came from.
Wow.
And it's sort of like, could we actually humanize one of these guys? If you took one of these guys, Ken Lay or Jack Abramoff or one of these idiots, and could you actually make a human being out of them by putting them in a position where they would have to do something, use all that talent and ambition to do something worthwhile for men? It's funny and it's poignant. And anyway, so I've been getting good reviews on all these things. Matter of fact, Monday night I'm workshopping. It's called SOS, that last one. And I'm going to be in Los Angeles. All 4 of those series are under option or development in different places right now. Dean Jones, who is Chris Columbus's production manager. Chris Columbus lives in San Francisco. He and I have kind of partnered up and discussed partnering up on some things. So I don't know. I'm hoping that we can do this. When Nash Bridges was here, it pumped $30 million a year into San Francisco's economy. $30 million a year. One television show. So what I would ultimately hope to see, I'd like to see all these technology folks and venture capitalist guys, the Google folks and Sun and Cisco and some of them, and some of these great filmmakers. Phil Kaufman and I are dear friends, have talked about doing some of these series together. And the methods of production and distribution are changing. Production is now far more digitized. We can do a period piece. I would like to do Telegraph Hill, my Bohemian Heart book. I'd actually like to do it in the 1930s with virtual sets and the existing. We still have all this great old Art Deco stuff in these wonderful buildings. Marry those to digital environments. Craig Barron, who owns Matt World in Novato, won the Academy Award for Benjamin Button, the greatest visual effects artist that I've ever seen, lives in Novato. So if we could just, if we could get the Google folks and the Cisco and the Sun and the Adobe people who recognized that they are the future of distribution and the future of technology, and some of the real storytellers, and we could get them to marry these elements together, I think San Francisco, we would have more than a renaissance. We would actually could make a glacial shift in the kinds of stories that are told. Good stories, human stories, real stories. And the way those stories are marketed to the world. I mean, the money is in television these days. For instance, Band of Brothers, which was a great thing, written by Eric Jendresen up in Sausalito. He was the lead writer.
I'm in agreement with you in all of this. However, I was wondering if you think one of the reasons why the people with the money, the Googles and the Ciscos, maybe they are a little bit in question about putting money into these types of projects. Could one of the reasons be because we don't have an MGM or a Columbia studio where they actually have a physical location for this money to be spent in what they perceive to be, in a rewarding kind of a situation? Well,
I hope not, because this is why. If there's anybody that should recognize the value of a good idea in an idea who has come, and the value of being, Philip Kaufman has directed some of the greatest movies in American history. He did The Unbearable Lightness of Being. He just did Hemingway and Gellhorn, the story of Ernest Hemingway and his last wife, of Clive Owens and Nicole Kidman.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the most, if not the most expensive movies that HBO has ever done. It's an HBO movie. They passed San Francisco off as Cuba. I mean, there's a challenge, right? And Ketchum, Idaho, too. I think there were several locations. You know, I hope that I would like to think, I would hope that the Google guys and again the Sun people and the Cisco folks recognize that their innovation and their outlaw spirit, their ideas that we don't have to be big to be relevant, to become big. We don't have to start big, because almost everybody who gets into the movie industry, who invests in the movie business, what they do is they give money to the big guys that don't need it, and then they're wondering why the movies never make a return on investment. Well, because the overhead's so high and you're spending all this stuff. In the Bay Area, the people who I know who work here, the Philip Kaufmans and the people like that, I keep mentioning Phil because there's just nobody better than Phil, is that they put the money on the screen. You want the money on the screen. Breaking Bad, which is a phenomenon on AMC, I think, is a low-budget television production, right. And everybody's gravitating. Justified is shot in, without major studio and all those things, and people are gravitating to these quality productions. The budget on Mad Men on AMC is a fraction of what they spend on, say, they spend more money on Kool-Aid and carrots and the craft services at CSI Miami than they do on Mad Men and Breaking Bad. I'd rather watch either one of those last two shows. So I think if there were some way in which the real filmmakers, I mean, Dean Jones is the greatest production manager in the business. He did all of Chris Columbus's films. I think that if they would ever sit down and see what it is we have and what we're doing, I think maybe that would change.
Well,
Hopefully.
I hope so. And so, as always, time always runs out before we could talk about half of what I want to discuss with my guests. But I really hope that anybody that's connected to the companies that we mentioned today with the resources will not let the fact that this is not an MGM CBS scenario prevent them from investing in a project that will be rewarding in the end, and that they will give somebody else a chance. And hopefully the little cell phones that are taking the little videos will also help to open people's eyes to the amount of ability that's out there not being utilized because of the lack of funding. So,
well, they could become MGM is the punchline.
Okay.
That's, they can build their own MGM and their own Universal.
Well, thank you so much, James, for being here. Thanks to my crew. Thanks to my viewers. I'm really grateful to everybody who has been here today to help me to make this show what it's been. Thank you so much for watching.